see if they're interested in asking you any questions.
Sounds good.
Okay. Why don't we start?
I'm Brandon, and I'm a sophomore.
I'm Ania, and I'm a senior.
I'm Nate, and I'm a freshman.
I'm Jackson, and I'm also a freshman.
And I'm Marcus, and I'm a freshman.
Nice to meet you guys.
So Alex, maybe you could just kind of start out by telling us a little bit about maybe your background, what you're currently doing, what your current career is all about. They've read your profile, much of your profile, so they have some background information. But maybe kind of just start off by telling us a little bit about how you got where you are today.
Okay. It seems like just yesterday I was in high school and really enjoyed English classes, history, social studies classes. I read a lot, books, of course, for schoolwork, but particularly liked to read magazines and newspapers, keep up with the world, and was a sports fan. I followed sports. And when I went off to college, I fell in with a group that was called the Press Club, and it was essentially undergrads who would cover campus events, some sports events, but also speakers who'd come onto campus or cultural events on campus, and write them up for newspapers or wire services within about a 40 to 50 mile distance of campus. So essentially these newspapers couldn't afford to have their own campus correspondent, but they were happy to pay a student a little bit to kind of keep an eye on things. And the best thing about doing that for me was anything I wrote I would see in print after it had been professionally edited. So I could look at what I turned in and then look at what appeared in the newspaper and see the difference. So I learned a lot by being professionally edited as a college student. And when I got out of college, I applied for an entry-level position at Sports Illustrated. They hire people as fact-checkers with a hope that they might become reporters and then writers. And so I did that, and I was very lucky to be able to be picked up as a fact-checker in the fall of 1980 at Sports Illustrated. And at that time, there was a fair amount of opportunity for movement, for getting assignments to actually do writing and not check the facts and the stories of other writers. And within a couple of years, I was fortunate enough to be a writer, to be named a staff writer. And I've essentially been there ever since. So I'm entering my 36th year on staff. And in between, along the way, I've been able to write a few books. My first 15 or so years at the magazine, I was very much following the news, did a lot of basketball at this time of year, covering colleges particularly, whatever team was hot. But then over the last 15 to 20 years, I've done more and more feature stories, historical features, personality profiles, looking at issues in sports. I did a story a few months ago about abusive coaching. I've done a lot of Olympic coverage. About a year ago, looked at the preparations for the Rio Olympics. So it's been a really nice mixed bag. I feel very fortunate. I don't have to chase the news every single week, so I'll go out, fill my notebook, come back to my home here on the western edge of the state of Vermont, and try to make sense of my notes in an article with all the pleasant muses that you get in this part of the world. So I'm a pretty lucky person, and there have been so many changes in the journalism world over the last 10 to 12 years that I've somehow been able to survive. I joke sometimes that it's hard to teach an old dog a new trick, and although I'm on Twitter, so many of the things that are part of a journalist's toolbox today are a little bit hard for me to pick up and get comfortable with. So I'm still writing largely long magazine pieces in an era of the very short little burst of information. I'm aware that that is where our business is going. I've made some accommodations to it. When I go cover the Olympics now, I find myself frequently with a video team. We go out and I might write a story, but there'll be a parallel video story that will be created in tandem with that. And I'm very, very impressed with the creativity of these videographers I work with. And I like to think that I've been able to figure out a way to to coexist with them. But that is the way the journalism world is going, and I can certainly share some thoughts about that with you if you guys are interested. If you're envisioning a future in journalism, you should think in terms of being nimble, being versatile, learning technology, and learning how to tell stories across different platforms. The good news is that human beings have always had an appetite to have a story told to them. If we go all the way back to our forefathers around a campfire in cave person days, they were telling stories. Those cave paintings on the walls of caves were stories. They were narratives. And regardless of how stories get delivered, I'm confident that the audiences will always be there, whether you're consuming that story on a little personal device or you're curling up with it in book form. One way or the other, it's just part of who we are. So that's, in a nutshell, sort of who I am and where I got to be where I am today.
Awesome. We're having, just continue. Okay, all right. We've got a little bit of a free screen issue, but I think we're just going to continue on. So now, do you guys have questions? Do you have anything specifically?
I'm just curious, like, what's a typical day for you?
A typical day for me will be I'll sort of help my kids and my wife get out the door to work, and then I'll make my way out to a converted cow barn that's now my studio office. And I might be doing research on the web. I might be making phone calls to fill my notebook, depending where I am in the course of preparing a story. If I already have a full notebook, I feel I have the material I need to write the story, I'll set about that process. And that can be, that's probably the most scary part, when you're looking at your laptop screen and there's just a blinking cursor on a blank sea of white. But slowly but surely, I start to sketch out the story. I figure out what my lead is, the proper flow. We have little breathing points within a story. And I'm not real good at working more than 2.5 hours at a time. So whether it's take the dog for a walk, or going and fixing myself a cup of tea back in the house, running an errand, if I can get 2.5 good hours of work in after breakfast, break for lunch, then come back and get a couple more hours in before the kids come home from school, it's been a pretty productive day. I will sometimes go over to Middlebury College. I live a couple miles from their campus, and try to play noontime basketball to clear my head, or go for a walk, or just something physical, because Leonardo da Vinci made this observation. I think it's very true that when you're a creative person trying to work, you need to be self-critical. You need to go back at what you've created with fresh eyes. And he believed that the number of times that you could leave your work and then return to it had a lot to do with how good it would wind up being. And I believe that if I can build up between the time I get an assignment and the time it's actually due, the more leavings and returnings I can build into my schedule, the better the final product will be. Because when you reread your work, you start to see its flaws, and you see where it can be fixed and improved. And the two things that I try to tell aspiring young writers are: be your own best editor. Read and reread and reread, and as you do that, rewrite. And the other thing I like to tell people is the best way to become a good writer is to read. To read, find the writers that you really enjoy reading, and then kind of reverse engineer what it is that they're doing that you like. And borrow the technique. It doesn't mean you plagiarize, you don't rip off the words, but you say to yourself, okay, this is working for me. And then you bring your voice to that technique and that strategy, and the result is something that is yours. And I've done that. All the writers that I know and respect will admit to some admiration for another writer, and using conventions that make it easy for the reader to follow a story.
Nate, do you want to ask a question?
Have you ever received negative feedback? And if so, how did you respond?
Oh yeah, I've received plenty of negative feedback. One of the things about the web today is that it is a means of democracy. that everybody has a voice, that when I hang my shingle out on Sports Illustrated, any different from anybody who has a blog or who might tweet out an opinion? And it's a good question. I like to think that because I'm a reporter, I've done some reporting that informs my opinion, or that I've been around for 36 years, that I can bring some perspective to something that I'm sharing that might give me some qualifications, but on the whole, it's a legitimate point. And I think that's one of the great things about the web and digital tools, is that everybody has a voice. I think as consumers, we need to be smart in shopping around for the voices that are the best credentialed, or at least we can judge somebody who doesn't have credentials and read whatever their opinion is with a very critical eye. But I'll give you one example of a time I got real feedback, negative feedback to something I wrote. I was asked in 1995 to do a story for Sports Illustrated about the University of Miami football team, which had had a lot of problems with player misbehavior and so forth. And in an open letter to the president of the school, I urged them to drop their football program and try to fix what was wrong, and then return 2 or 3 years later with a fixed program and reintroduce it. And this ran as a cover story, why the University of Miami should drop football. And I was a very unpopular person in South Florida. In fact, so unpopular that morning drive time shock jocks, DJs, called my home phone without any warning, trying to get me to answer for my story live on the air. And I made the mistake of having the greeting on my answering machine be, "Hi, you've reached 212-753-4720. Sorry, I'm not here right now." And all that did was lead to many more phone calls from other people around South Florida who had just gotten my home phone number. So I wrote that one out over the course of about a week. But
my God.
yeah, sometimes you put yourself out there and you make yourself vulnerable. So that's probably the most colorful example of when I got negative feedback.
Jackson, you want to answer?
Yeah. Do you think it was hard? Was it hard to find a journalism job, and do you think it would be harder now to find one, or about the same, and how has it kind of changed?
Well, the big change is there are so many sources of content now, and there aren't foolproof ways for that content to make money. So there are plenty of people out there spending their days creating content for the web. So yes, you can find jobs, if you want to define job loosely. The real challenge is to find a journalism outfit that will actually pay a living wage for content. So yeah, there's what are called legacy media brands, like the one I work for, that have been around forever and do pay living wages. But there are lots of others, and a lot of them are in sports, where I think kind of cynical entrepreneurs take advantage of how much people love sports and figure, oh, they'll cover their favorite team for me for free. And the challenge is to find a place that will pay you a living wage. And there's nothing wrong with being a blogger or contributing to SB Nation as the Boston Red Sox correspondent or a Boston Red Sox correspondent and not accepting a living wage from that. But again, you have to somehow feed yourself and clothe yourself and put a roof over your head. So my advice would be, if you're angling for a journalism job, is to put in the work. If you have to for a short period of time, do it for little or no pay. It's worth doing because it helps you compile a set of clips, examples of your work. And most editors who can hire, they will hire based on how you've proven you can do the work. So in terms of a strategy, it's a good one. And as you go through high school and college, if there's a chance to write for your student paper, it's a great way to get that experience while you're being housed and fed already. So I highly recommend that. And it does happen that people are hired right out of college in a journalism job.
I have a question. So, do you have any internships in high school or college?
Did I have internships in university?
Yes.
Yes. I spent one summer as an intern at Time magazine in New York. It was 8 weeks. They rotated me through lots of different parts of the magazine, so I got a taste of everything from photography to editing to writing to fact-checking. Time magazine is constructed a little differently from typical daily newspapers. Whereas a newspaper reporter will do his or her own reporting before writing up a story, at Time, at least in those days, they divided the labor. And I got a good taste, and it may have contributed to my being hired at Sports Illustrated because Sports Illustrated had the same fact-checking procedure that Time magazine did. So it was also a good way to get a sense of the rhythm of a weekly magazine, that internship. Very different from a newspaper, very different from a monthly magazine. And of course, very different from the current news cycle that we're used to with the web, where stories are constantly being updated. It's almost a minute-to-minute sort of phenomenon. But I do recommend internships. A great way to get not just some experience, but more than that, just a window on what that work style might be like and whether it's something that you can see yourself doing.
What's the most challenging part of your job?
I think the most challenging part for me is what I alluded to a moment ago, that sitting down with a full notebook where there's just chaos in your notebook and beginning the process of imposing order on that chaos. So I'm looking at a blinking cursor on a blank laptop screen, and I've created nothing. I might have thought of a few ideas, jotted down a few notes, maybe sketched out an outline of how a story might read, but quotes, facts, they're all kind of mysteriously in my notebook, and they somehow not only have to transfer over to the white space on my laptop, but it has to be entertaining somehow. It has to draw the reader in, and that never gets easy. But there are points in the process of writing where I feel exhilaration if I can begin to see that the riddle is being solved. And there is a point, and I joke with my wife about it, about 85 or 90% through, where I feel that the story is essentially there. And everything beyond that point is just polishing and tinkering and making what's good better. And for me, that's the most satisfying part. And I now, after 36 years, know that from that beginning point, I'm going to get to that later point. And of course, I'm always reminded of the famous comment by Ernest Hemingway, which was, "I hate to write, but I love having written." I definitely see the truth in that.
Yeah, do you collaborate with other journalists often?
I do sometimes. Yeah, I've written, a few times I've written books with other journalists, and I did a big story about the NCAA a couple of years ago with another journalist on our staff, and a little more recently than that, I did a historical retelling of a famous college basketball game with a journalist at Time. And it's a tricky thing. I mean, there are different ways of collaborating. You can have one person do the reporting and research, and another person just take it all and write it up. Sometimes it involves one person doing a draft and the other person kind of reworking the draft. So you're kind of swapping drafts. Most of the collaborating I've done with other journalists, I've been kind of the writer, whereas the other journalist has been the reporter. And I think that's also harks back to my days as a news magazine intern, where that division of labor was pretty commonplace. You probably think it's it might be difficult. You might imagine two people hunched over one computer screen, and sometimes with difficult stories, that's what happens. You have to go over every word in every sentence and sort of parse out all the little subtle meanings. But that's not very time. It doesn't make sense to work that way. That work style is, I find it to be really challenging. So generally, the projects that are best for me have been ones where the division of labor is pretty set.
So, what is the greatest event that you've been to that you experienced?
Well, that's a tough one. There was a game during the NCAA basketball tournament back in 1992 where you've probably seen the clip during March Madness where a Duke player, Christian Laettner, made a crazy shot at the end of a game to win it, 104 to 103. Just by the score, you could tell it was a crazy game. And I was courtside for that and wrote it up. But then I've covered a number of pretty great spectacles over the years. Excuse me. I'm lucky enough to have covered a bunch of Olympics, and the Barcelona Olympics, the London Olympics,
Those are probably the coolest.
the Lillehammer Olympics, all memorable ones. And it would be hard for me to pinpoint one moment in those Olympics that stood out, but just the spirit, the vibe, the organization, the level of achievement, how impressionable I was. I remember Barcelona was still relatively young in my career and made a huge impression on me. But then I've covered some events that were kind of obscure in some ways that have made a big impression on me. I remember when UVM had an undefeated women's basketball team, and I happened to go down and see them play their first NCAA tournament game that year at George Washington in D.C. There were 12 buses of fans who came from Vermont to watch the game. And the entire Vermont congressional delegation, because it was in D.C., came out to watch the game. And I wasn't yet a Vermont resident, but there was something really plucky and fun about this team that was underrated and overlooked. And here they were coming into this game undefeated, but they couldn't host the game because the people doing the seating hadn't really respected them. And they should have won the game. They lost on the last play. One of their players drove into the lane and tried to pass to a teammate, but the pass got fumbled, and that was the end. They lost by a point. But I remember that evening really vividly, and in some ways that was a great performance. Just a team that loses because one player is trying to find a teammate with a pass, and it didn't quite connect. It's kind of a noble way to lose. So here I am years later telling a bunch of fellow Vermonters about that game.
Actually.
So has your job in like Sports Illustration, has your job ever changed your life, and if so, how?
Well, it definitely has helped determine the course of my life. Getting the job didn't change my life, but I was 23 years old when I first started working there, and I had to figure out a way to balance the demands of the job, a fair amount of travel, some tough deadlines, occasional all-nighters or most of the nighters. So I kind of had to work my way through that, and it affected my ability to have work-life balance. I didn't get married until I was 41 years old. So I was kind of, I was a road warrior, I guess would be the way to put it, for many of those years. So it determined the course of my life to some extent, and I feel very lucky that since getting married and finding my way to Vermont and not being a slave to the beat, following the news every week, I have been able to find that balance. And it's been the most rewarding part of my time. Of those 36 years have been the last 15 or so, because I don't feel I've been a slave to the rat race. And the stories I'm doing tend to have higher nutritional value. It's not the potato chip from week to week potato chip news that keeps people coming back for more. It's much more, I'll disappear for 2 or 3 months, and then I'll turn something in that's long and substantive and And when that gets in print and usually gets more feedback, that can be really rewarding.
What is the coolest interview? What is the coolest interview you have done with an athlete or a coach or something around there?
Well, there's one great coach named Dean Smith, whom I really enjoyed interviewing. He was a coach at North Carolina for years. He's in the Hall of Fame. And as it happened, the very same time he was there and I was covering college basketball about 7 or 8 miles away at Duke, there was another great coach who's still there, Mike Krzyzewski. And I found myself interviewing them both frequently on the same trip. And I was always struck when I would leave the interviews at how different the two coaches were, and personalities were different. Dean Smith was very reluctant to share a lot of detail about his team, whereas Krzyzewski would tell you just about anything. And
He just would ramble.
so the contrast was really stark after I would do the interviews. But the real lesson for me was they were both really successful, but they did it with different styles. And I think that's an important lesson to learn, and it's a lesson that applies to writing and journalism too, which is that if you tend to the fundamentals, you can have an individual voice. There are a lot of different routes to excellence, so long as you cover the bases. In our family, we have an expression that we like to use with our kids, which I think really applies to writing and to anything that requires rigor, and that is learn the rules, follow the rules, then break the rules. Because you'll know those exceptions where it's worth breaking the rules. It makes sense to break the rules if you really know the rules and you follow the rules. And I think good leaders understand that you have to give the people that you're leading some freedom so that they can really develop. And very few of the successful coaches I've covered, I think, would argue with that prescription. I'm not sure that. I hope this podcast doesn't think that I'm giving you guys license to go out and break the rules.
No.
But think about it. It's good food for thought.
What is the most valuable lesson that you've learned in your career?
Well, one of the most important things is making yourself useful, or indispensable if you can, but useful. I think if you're starting out in my business, see if you can develop that sixth sense in the workplace of what is it that other people need me to do. Don't expect to show up for work and expect there'll be somebody who's looking out for you who's going to tell you exactly what you need to do to succeed. See if you can anticipate what it is that's needed by the team and go take the initiative and fill that need. And if you do that, it's going to get noticed and appreciated. And I've seen time and time again people who follow that prescription, their careers tend to do pretty well. Because it shows an empathy. It shows a kind of people skill that you're putting yourself in the shoes of other people. A skill that's been helpful for me as I've just chased stories on the road and had to turn stories in on deadline has been to not wait till the last minute. You know, it's human nature to procrastinate. But that Da Vinci quote I shared with you before, I think really underscores how if you can build in enough time and do your work rigorously before that deadline whacks you over the head, that you're going to wind up doing better work because you're going to be able to go back and be self-critical and improve and tinker and revise again and again. And sometimes I work on stories where that's impossible because it's such a tough deadline. But where it is possible, I've found that it's well worth doing, planning it out.
How did you know this was the right career for you?
Well, I've always loved words, loved to read, enjoyed writing, a little bit of a wild writer, I think, when I was young, and I had a couple of good teachers who got the wild out of me, or enough of it out of me, so I could be a little more pleasant to read. So I got some pretty good positive feedback and encouragement from teachers early on. And then in college, I think it really kicked in. I took one course in particular. It was a writing seminar. There were 16 students, and we would exchange our stories every week and read one another's stories and comment on them. And there was a little bit of competitiveness in the class in a good way. So I think everybody felt there was a bar that was being set that we were aspiring to. And I kindled to that. I reacted. It got the best out of me. And I think that was my sophomore year in college, the spring semester. I think that put me pretty much on the path to where I am today. I took a year off from college after that sophomore year and continued to do writing and came back to finish up for 2 more. And writing was a big part of it. And I chose a major where I would write. History, and all of that, I think, conspired to set me on my way.
So you weren't a journalism major, is that right, Alex?
No, I wasn't. I was a history major.
Yeah.
And the college I went to didn't have a journalism major per se, but they had writing courses. So it was a really nice combination. So majoring in history, a subject where you have to write 2 junior papers and a senior thesis. And history, I mean, the actual word history implies storytelling. The word story is in there. So I was doing that. I was taking the occasional writing course that was offered. And then, very importantly, I was doing that writing for the University Press Club, where I would cover events on campus and turn the stories in for real newspapers, where it got edited by real editors. So I was getting this kind of parallel education. At the same time, I was getting a more theoretical education.
So you mentioned going to North Carolina and Washington. How much do you get to travel?
I do travel a fair amount. I don't travel as much now as I did earlier in my career when I would be on the road just chasing that week's news. Now I might go to a big event, for instance, the Olympics. I'll be going to Rio in August for 3.5 weeks. But then a year before the Rio Olympics, I went to Rio to do a 1-year out story on their preparations for the games. And I went down there for 7 days to fill my notebook. They sent me to Australia to do a story on an Australian player for the San Antonio Spurs, Patty Mills. So I'm very fortunate to work for a place that is willing to spend the money to allow me to go out and get the story and then spend the time to tell it properly and then give it the space so it doesn't have to be cut to the bone. And that is harder and harder in our current media environment. Our magazine, our print magazine, is not nearly as fat as it once was. So we spend more resources on the web than ever before. But that's where the readers are. We have to do that. I'm a little bit of that old dog. It's hard to teach the new trick to, so I'm grateful that there's still some support for those long magazine stories. But generally, my travel now is much more surgical and targeted and briefer. And I won't write a story in a hotel room the way I once did. For the most part, I can bring my notes back and write it here in Vermont.
How long does a story take to write, typically?
You know, a typical long feature, I might spend 2 or 3 weeks reporting it. And then I'd like to have at least a week to write it up. And if I can have 10 days or even 2 weeks and I'm not procrastinating as a result of that extra time, I can tell the difference. I can tell that the quality is going to be better. It's just more polished. So I'd say 4 to 5 weeks typically is kind of the life cycle of a feature story in the magazine. And sometimes it's shorter because they need the story sooner. And sometimes it's longer because some critical interview can't be scheduled when I want it to be scheduled. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Are you working on a story right now?
I am. I've just begun working on a story about sports and money. It sounds very vague and general.
It is super vague right there.
It's pretty vague, but I think everybody in the room there, you guys all understand that given the salaries and the rights fees,
My God.
we're sitting on what might be a bubble. That the question is whether all this money flowing into sports is sustainable. And a lot of people are cutting the cord on their cable deals because they can go mobile. And what is that going to mean for, say, ESPN, which buys all the rights to these events because they've been able to get this huge amount of money from every cable subscriber? Well, what happens if you guys, the next generation, are cord cutters and don't have cable? Is the whole economic underpinnings of sports, is it going to collapse? Those are the kinds of questions I'm going to consider in this story and try to get answers to. And if that source of revenue does collapse, what are the potential new sources of revenue? Maybe daily fantasy revenue. Who knows? So those are the issues that I'm going to be juggling. And so I'm about 2 or 3 weeks into starting to set up interviews and doing reading. It's probably going to take a little longer to do this story than a typical story because it's complicated, and I want to talk to stakeholders and everybody from broadcast executives to agents to commissioners of leagues. I want to look at the international aspect of this as well as the U.S., pro and college. So it's going to be one of these big kahuna stories, and I hope to have it done maybe by early April.
Are you going to do an interview with Roger Goodell about this?
You know, just yesterday I put in a request to speak to Adam Silver,
Oh,
the
yes.
commissioner of the NBA. I don't know, I may try to talk to Goodell too, but I know the NBA
Goodell.
in particular, the NBA is right at the forefront of trying to find new revenue. They're talking about gambling, perhaps encouraging the legalization of gambling if there's some revenue in that. And they're also looking at the possibility of putting logos on uniforms, which is commonplace outside the U.S., but if they were to do it, it would be first time in one of the major pro sports leagues. So I think Adam Silver is somebody who's kind of at the forefront of all this. You think I should talk to Roger Goodell?
Yeah. I mean,
I asked.
I'm a big Pats fan, and I kind of don't agree with what all he did about the Deflategate. That really put me over the edge.
Well, I'd love to hold him to account for that, except it would be a little bit off topic for the story that I'm writing. But
I just wanted...
if I do get time with him, I'll mention that there's somebody at Harwood who has a beef.
Cool.
I've got a
Yeah.
question. So I want to know: are there times, or how do you do this internally? I'm thinking that working for Sports Illustrated, and the kinds of stories that you write, you have to remain pretty objective. So are there stories in the past or things that if you were freelancing, you would have been much more opinionated, or how do you juggle that in your writing?
It's a great question. I mean, it's something that we're always aware of. I like to say that you always want to be fair in your writing, but being fair and being objective are two different things. At Sports Illustrated, we're encouraged to be subjective, to have voice, and depending on the story, to inject opinion. It's welcome in certain instances, and sometimes I'll write for the scorecard section in the front, which is very essay-like, and they expect you to have a point of view. But if you're being fair, I don't think anybody begrudges you having a point of view. That means you don't go off half-cocked and lodge allegations and say you were writing about Deflategate. You know, try not to let your Pats fan freak flag fly, as it were. So sorry about that, but
It's okay. It's okay.
But no, it's a very good question, and one of the things that really appeals to me about writing for Sports Illustrated is that you're encouraged to have voice in your stories. That if you pick up the newspaper and you read an Associated Press story about, say, one of last night's games, it's going to be very meat and potatoes, just the facts. There might be a few quotes in there. If one team shot 3 for 33, you'd expect there to be a judgment made about the quality of the shooting. But in our magazine, partly because people already know the results of these events, they're expecting some kind of a take, some analysis, some opinion, a little more of the human side getting play. So we do have that license.
Have you ever gotten any like positive feedback that you used in your stories?
No, I've certainly gotten positive feedback. I mean, when we get enthusiasm from readers for a story, editors are likely to think, well, maybe we should do more stories like that. We do a very popular issue, a double issue in the summer called the Where Are They Now issue.
Yep.
Everybody loves that.
I read that.
Revisiting people from the past and finding what they're up to. And I love doing stories for it. Our readers love reading them. I think because it's a double issue, people kind of linger over it a little bit. We don't publish the following week with a new issue. So that's a great example where readers have told us what they want, and we're happy to give it to them.
Who do you look up to in the sports field when you were a kid or currently?
Who do I look up to in the sports field journalistically or among athletes and coaches?
Both.
Both. Well, there's some wonderful people in my business I really enjoy reading. There's a guy who wrote for Grantland when Grantland was still around, and now still writes for Esquire a lot on sports, named Charlie Pierce. I've been reading him for years. He's become a pretty good friend. Talk about voice. He's got a lot of voice in his writing. And he lives down in Boston, so he'll write frequently about some of the teams it sounds like you guys are interested in. He's great. His writing is informed by a lot of knowledge of history and politics and society, which I always enjoy. And then we've had writers named Frank DeFord and Gary Smith who wrote wonderful long feature stories that I grew up reading. And every now and then Gary and Frank still do stories for us. For the most part, they're retired, but I'm a big fan of both of their writing. And I even enjoy Bill Simmons occasionally. He writes for, he's doing his HBO thing now and all, but I really enjoyed the book he did called The Book of Basketball, where he riffs on the NBA. And I think what I like about Simmons is that he's a fan. He, unlike so many of the people in my business who are sports writers, we're kind of adopt this serious critic's role. Simmons writes about sports from the perspective of a fan, and I think that's the reason he's so popular, because he hasn't forgotten what it is that brought him to sports in the first place. As for athletes and coaches, I've got to say, watching the NFL playoffs over the last few weeks, I really wanted Arizona to win because Larry Fitzgerald, I once did a story on him, and he's one of the great human beings I've encountered in sports. And I just thought it would be great to see him do well. This is as a fan, not as a professional journalist. But the more I see of Cam Newton and hear from him, the more I'm impressed by him. And I'm thinking that Cam Newton is an impressive athlete who's carrying himself pretty well on the big stage. And Michael Phelps is another athlete I'll be eager to see do well in Rio, because his story is he's had rough patches in his life, but he seems to have taken some steps to straighten things out.
Alex, yeah, I want to be respectful of your time too, and I know that some of these students need to move on to their classes. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Is there any little piece of advice maybe that you would give high school students who are interested in pursuing journalism or writing, and just one little tidbit?
I touched on this earlier, but I'll underscore it again. You dive in if you love it, if you love the subject, if you love writing, if you love telling stories, dive in and do it, and don't let, how am I going to make a living at this, get in the way of your passion and your dreams. Because that stuff will get sorted out. You don't even have to worry about that until you get out of college. If you go to college, you're going to have a bed, you're going to be fed. That's your time to explore. And go for it. That's what I did, and it sorted itself out. And if you have the talent, the drive, and the ambition, it's going to work for you too. That's just, there's so many people for whom that formula has worked. So give it a shot. This is far too early for you to extinguish the flame of your dreams.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We
Thank you guys.
appreciate your time, and good luck with the article coming up.
Thanks so much. You guys keep an eye out.
I'm gonna hope to read it.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. Bye.
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 Am I gonna be able to get lunch?
Yep, if you just hold on 1 second, I'll go over.